Hi, I'm Michelle, and welcome to the Grateful Podcast, a place where we contemplate how we can eat, live, and lead each day to build a more sustainable world. My guest on the podcast today is Sandra Mikhail, who is a nutritionist and dietitian, and also the founder of an organization called Nutrition A to Z. And Sandra is super passionate about helping people understand and navigate the topics of gut health, but she's equally as passionate about how we can weave sustainability and nutrition and health together rather than discussing them as separate topics. And I thought it would be really nice to chat with her and get some further insights into some really important topics like the nexus of gut health and mental health, how we can eat in a way that supports both our own health and the health of the planet, and also get her tips from navigating this space herself and having the courage and ambition to start her own organization after years of working in clinical practice and in hospitals and in more formal institutional structures.
I remember we chatted a few months ago and you were telling me what interesting emails you get in your inbox because of the topic you deal with, being a gut health specialist. People obviously write to you about the most unusual topics that most people don't get to deal with on a daily basis. So I was actually wondering what it was that first inspired you or motivated you to become a specialist in gut health.
Look, it's not the first time I get asked this question, but as I tell people, I had no choice. It was literally a part of my life being the daughter of a gastroenterologist. So literally growing up, table talk. So at dinner time, you would hear things. So my dad's phone would ring and you would hear things like, oh, rectal bleeding or hemorrhoids, stage XYZ, or, what sort of a gut resection are we talking about? And my friends would be sitting there horrified. And I remember a friend of mine going home, did I just hear your dad say rectal? I was like, yep, you just heard that. Totally normal. So it was just, again, it was part of my upbringing and seeing him do what he does. Obviously, I had this whole fascination around gut health, around gut disorders. And as I got older and then going, into uni and studying nutrition and dietetics, the course made sense because it was a perfect marriage between medicine, let's say, the human body, and food. Because I did not want to go into medicine, and my parents never pushed me into that. And then fast forward, being at uni and doing our clinical rotations, every time I was on, let's say, the gastro ward or working in gastroenterology, I was like, man, this is awesome. Because it was so powerful to see how nutrition is an essential part of the treatment and, let's say, managing a gut health condition. And then suffering my own gut crisis, as I call it. So over a decade ago now. So yeah, it was almost 10 years ago where I was diagnosed with IBS. And then the more I got into it, the more I realized there is so much taboo around something that is part of our day-to-day life. So a lot of people call me, either the poo lady or, the comments that I get is, especially for men, Sandra, you make poo talk salon chic. I was like, well, thank you very much. That is like the best compliment ever. And when, my clients start to describe their bowel movements as being tremendous or like seeing all this progress, that literally makes my day. So again, as I said, it was meant to be. It was absolutely meant to be. And there was no way out of it. And I'm extremely glad to be working in this area.
Yeah. I think it's such a relevant field that has got a lot of attention, particularly in the last 5 or 10 years. And in particular, this connection between diet and gut health and then mental health as well. So what do you think are the most important things for people to know at this nexus?
Look, it's not as simplistic as many of us may, we're still scratching the surface. Yes, we talk about, or whenever people talk about gut health, it always appears as like a separate entity. We're talking about this separate network. But at the end of the day, as humans, everything is interconnected. So what we're seeing now is that whatever impacts our gut health impacts different systems all across our body, whether it's your heart health, your skin, your lungs, especially let's say right now with COVID. Again, I am probably biased because gut is, the center of everything, and I will keep bringing it back to gut health. But for me, again, just looking at how my career spanned, it started off in mental health. So even over a decade ago, I worked with patients that were suffering from different mental health conditions, whether it's schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, etc., depression, anxiety disorders. And what we noticed is just tweaking their diet to, let's say, incorporating more plants, redefining what balanced eating means to them alongside their medical treatment had huge success. Yeah. So the more I started to get into it, even, further into my career, I'm a mental health advocate. I do suffer from anxiety. And I start noticing that little tweaks to your diet that, let's say, have a huge benefit to your gut, especially your inner ecosystem, has a huge benefit to your mental health as well. So, and the other thing that I always remind people is your brain and your gut are anatomically connected by this long tube. So they're constantly chit-chatting about how everyone else is going. So this is also a good way to, every time I remind people to eat for their gut, I always say, look, you're not just eating for that gut, you're eating for literally every part of your body. And even when it comes to our approach, I always use 4 pillars. So addressing nutrition, movement, sleep, and the mind. Because regardless of what, whether it's gut health or heart health or whatever it is, these 4 pillars are literally crucial, are the foundations of, in my opinion, well-being, amongst other things. So again, we're just scratching the surface. I think you have to, keep up to date with the research and try your best and see what applies to you when it comes to your own gut. How do you say, your gut journey, as I call it.
Absolutely. It is an individualized journey for everyone. That said, you mentioned there are some sort of tweaks. What would be your sort of top tweaks that people could consider if they're wanting to support their gut health more?
So let's say my top 2 tweaks. One would be to eat more plants. The reason why I say this is we know we do not get enough fiber, which is sort of the backbone of plants, you can say. And at the end of the day, fiber is crucial for nourishing your inner ecosystem. What we know nowadays is that not only is it, back in the day, we knew little about fiber. We used to classify fiber as like, we have 2 or 3 different types of fiber. Right now, we know we have more than 50 or 100 types of different fibers. And maybe directly, fiber doesn't benefit us so much. Yes, it keeps us fuller for longer. So it can help with, let's say, maintaining your blood sugar levels, keeping you fuller for longer. So weight management, etc. But at the end of the day, just think of it as food for your gut bugs. What your gut bugs do is they protect us. Let's say they play a huge part when it comes to your immune system, and they need to be nourished and they need to be strengthened. And this is what fiber does. So that would be one thing. Fiber comes from plants. We know that we don't eat enough plants. And one way that I get my clients to start eating more plant foods is to aim for 30 plant-based ingredients per week. So it's a little exercise that I get a lot of clients to do. Look at what your base current intake is. And we list all the vegetables, the fruits, legumes, whole grains, nuts and seeds, and herbs and spices as well. And then it's like a little exercise to calculate your score and see what your baseline score is and gradually work your way, work your way towards that number 30. From a mental health perspective, now what we're looking at in terms of fiber is that, so fiber gets digested or fermented by your gut bugs. The byproducts of fermentation are called short chain fatty acids. And this is where all the research is currently looking at. So these are sort of anti-inflammatory compounds that have huge benefits. And perhaps we don't know, but perhaps that fiber can, or these byproducts of fermentation can play a role in mental health. So that's one way to look at it. And the other top tip I would have is, look, there's a lot, but I would say stress and the mind. We underestimate how stress or chronic stress can manifest physically. And
Absolutely.
a lot of the times, every person that has had, I've had a burnout. I've had actually 2 burnouts.
Mm-hmm.
Every client that has come to me with gut issues have struggles with stress. They are struggling, especially nowadays with the current pandemic and lockdown, et cetera, and all the uncertainty. The way stress impacts our gut health, as I said, remember, we're constantly chit-chatting, brain and gut. So stress can affect the motility, so how your gut muscles move. And the biggest example that I use is anyone diagnosed with IBS. If you are nervous or anxious, a lot of people will end up having diarrhea or constipation or a mix of both. The other thing is what stress can do or may do, because it's not really conclusive when it comes to the science, is that it might impact the diversity of your inner ecosystem. So it might kill off all the good gut bugs that we need that maybe help protect us or help support our immune system. So this is why I always say nutrition, think of plants, but don't neglect the mind as well when it comes to your gut health.
Yeah, absolutely.
Keeping it simple. I was going to say, I'm trying to keep it simple here and practical as well, but it's easier said than done.
Absolutely. We all know that firsthand, right? But I like how you highlighted this two-way relationship, which I think tends to get overlooked quite often. And it sounds like, when you're talking about plants and fiber, you're starting to sort of talk a little bit about prebiotics. And I think that there's a lot of confusion out there about probiotics and prebiotics and what are they? Are they good?
Yep.
Could you tell me a little bit more about your thoughts on these things?
So think about probiotics are your healthy gut bugs that have lots of benefits. As I said, not only do they support our immune system. So I always think of probiotics or your good gut bugs as guardians of your inner galaxy. They communicate with your immune cells on how to respond to infection. But also what they do is they regulate lots of other systems. They produce certain vitamins. They produce certain hormones as well. They help digest food. So their roles are expansive. And the other thing is they indirectly or directly communicate with your brain. That's probiotics. Prebiotics, keeping it very simple, is a food for your probiotics. So for me, what I find a bit frustrating is for such a long time, we focus so much on probiotics and probiotic supplements, and people don't necessarily understand that actually probiotic supplements should be treated like medication. And again, there's so much misuse, and we'll talk about misinformation, I think, down the line, but there's just so much misinformation around probiotics. And I want people to shift more towards the prebiotic sort of picture where why don't you focus on just nourishing your own inner ecosystem? Yes, there is a time and place for probiotic use, but I feel like why don't we actually just use plants, start to educate people about all the different types of fibers, what their roles are, and how they actually indirectly affect our overall health. Yeah. So that these are, as I said, people do tend to, get confused. And to this day, everyone has done some sort of probiotic supplement. And I was like, why? Who sold you that? Well, I saw it on social media, right. XYZ wellness unicorn said it was amazing. So I had to give it a go. Yeah. And you're like, well, you know what? A lot of the times it's a waste of money. There's only a certain type of people that may benefit from probiotic supplementation. But as I said, if you've got a cough, you would, I'm using this as a very simple example, you would take cough medicine. That's the same thing with probiotics. There's a specific type of strain that you would use to treat or to address a specific condition that we're trying to manage. Mm. But yeah, there's not a lot of regulation when it comes to that. Luckily, we have people like us to hopefully have a reach and just bust all these myths that are currently going around.
Yeah, and there's a few out there. I have that question for you as well, because I know you're quite vocal in calling out misinformation on the internet and particularly on social media, because when it comes to nutrition, it's a jungle out there, and there's so many people profiting from selling very simple messages that are attached to products or services that can make a lot of money. So what do you think are some of the most dangerous kind of myths out there at the moment?
Look, I don't know where to start. That's the thing. I honestly don't know where to start when it comes to this. For me, the issue is regardless of whatever you hear, question and be critical. The issue is right now on social media, it is unregulated territory. At least right now, I mean, I think there is some light shedding about false information because you can actually report false information. And sometimes, well, I don't, scroll like I did beforehand, but I tend to be the Instagram police. And I have reported so many, it's like false information. The issue is a lot of these claims, again, I don't want to be really specific, but a lot of these claims take advantage of people who are vulnerable, who have tried it all, right? So things like celery juice, for example, this whole movement was started by someone who gets medical advice from spirits. That to me is I have no words. That's the thing. Like, I honestly have no words. But kudos to his marketing team. I mean, I've been blocked off his Instagram account because I like to debate and challenge. Like, oh, well, that's interesting. Where did you get that information from? Or can you please, source your... So the issue that I find is these people have a phenomenal marketing plan. That's one thing. And two, I feel like we as health professionals in a way failed in how we communicate messages. Because a lot of the times we always go, it's all about the science. It is. I mean, I would lose my license if I do not, provide evidence-based practice. But it's how we communicate the science to the public. And this is, I feel, a struggle for every person, whether you're, at different parts of nutrition, even when it comes to sustainability. It's how you communicate these messages to the public. And unfortunately, we just get lost in all the boring talk. People don't want to hear about, which journal article did you use? You know what I mean? So
yes, I know very well what you mean.
So this is where I feel like we, as let's say accredited health professionals, have failed, and these, I'm going to keep calling them wellness unicorns, have succeeded. It's a bottomless pit when it comes to the amount of misinformation that's out there. Two big areas where I would say people please be careful, and again, looking at vulnerable groups, are oncology, so cancer, and autoimmune disease. These would be two areas where there's a lot of misinformation out there because people want to sell. Why? As medicine hasn't offered the answers yet. And this is the whole thing about science. Science doesn't always have the answers. So people within these groups feel like medicine has failed them. And this is why they end up going to the other extreme, or to the other end of where the wellness unicorns will offer all these promises. Mm-hmm. So I feel like if there's, two areas where a lot of nutrition misinformation lies, it will be within cancer and autoimmune disease.
I think it was interesting before when you were talking about the important role of prebiotics and how it's great to have, 30 or more different plants in your diet each day. And that for me is a link now to sustainability, because the more diversity we can get on our plate also can help build diversity in the fields and build more resilient production systems. Exactly. So diversity is that interface between health and sustainability. And Absolutely. Well, you're actually one of the few nutritionists that I know who is really fascinated about this interface and about sustainability. And this is obviously so important because it's a complex system and we need to tackle it from soil to stomach and beyond. Absolutely. So I'd sort of love to hear from your perspective, where do you see sustainable eating and healthy eating overlapping? And where do you see that there are trade-offs that we need to manage, where, for example, something that's more sustainable may not be as good for human health or human gut health, and vice versa?
It is definitely not an easy question to answer. And I feel like there's a lot of layers to it. Yeah. A lot of people coming to me, or clients would come and say, look, we want to try to transition to a more sustainable way of living, more sustainable way of eating, but we just don't know where to start. It just gets really overwhelming because you start reading, well, hold on. If I want to be more plant-based, then I will need to maybe switch to soy products, or maybe I will end up eating, I'm using this as an example because we can talk about cashews, for example, because there's a lot of plant-based cheeses that use cashews. And then you read more and they're like, hold on, but that is not sustainable unless you know where your cashews are coming from. The way I see it is we need to kind of, one, pick and choose our battles, two, try not to overwhelm yourself with a lot of changes. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So when people come into my practice, first thing I ask, we look at, okay, what would be achievable right now for you to do? And the themes, so I try to set a theme for every 3 months or even every year. One could be less food waste. That is doable. That is also a part of sustainability. The other thing would be cutting down on animal-based products. Now, I want to be very careful with how I say this. When we talk about minimizing or cutting down on animal-based products, I'm speaking from a person that comes from privilege and food accessibility and food availability. So when I start highlighting, let's say, reducing meat consumption would be the first goal we would work on as a privileged society with an abundance of food availability. So that would be actually one of the first goals I would work on. The next part would be the food waste. So this is how we made the transition as a family. And for me, I try to set a theme for the year. Food waste was the second thing, because it does take a little bit of time to understand your family's eating habits, to understand, right, how to be smart when it comes to food scraps. What could I do with that? And that for me, I think, was a huge change, especially after being a mom and having a child. And the amount of food sometimes that was wasted, I would it literally ate my, it just broke my heart. So I had to adjust the way I shopped, or strategically shop or do our shopping. So first would be cutting meat consumption down as a privileged society. Number 2 would be food waste. Number 3 would be understanding or just being a bit more mindful about where our food comes from. So this is something that I feel a lot of us neglect or don't even address. And that can actually come down the line or down that transition or journey to a more sustainable way of living. It's almost impossible to do everything at the same time without it overwhelming you. And this, I feel, is where I personally am at, is just understanding, where does my food come from? So as I said, there are different layers to it. And at the end of the day, it's really about redefining the balance as you go between health and environment. And I feel like one of the first things that we can do, again, as a privileged society, which connects immediately to your environment, is meat consumption. We're eating way too much, both meat and dairy, full stop. We know that as a given. But then trying to apply that to other communities, that's where the big question mark comes in. This is why I told you I have to be very careful with my choice of words.
And I understand it very well, because I do think it's very important that we have conversations, particularly around meat consumption, in a very balanced and aware way. Every person has a different context that they're dealing with. They have different constraints and different challenges they're facing, and there's no one size fits all. So
exactly, absolutely.
Let's talk about it in a more nuanced way. And that's also comes to how animal products are produced, what sort of production systems they come from. Not all are the same in terms of impact. So there's definitely room for more nuance in these conversations.
Yep.
That also links, I think, very well to this Eat Lancet report, which came out at the beginning of 2019. And this is basically outlining a planetary health diet, a diet that would be helpful for the planet, to help us stay within planetary boundaries and to support human health. Now, it's important to say this study, I guess they had 30 researchers working for 3 years, and it explicitly didn't consider social considerations like labor conditions and things like this. So that's outside of it.
Exactly. That's what the big criticism comes in. But I feel like this is not just with the Lancet. This is everything that we address when it comes to, let's say, obesity, the fight against obesity. We're not addressing we're not addressing food systems. We're not addressing all these different factors that come to play. It's not just about the food, it's not just about what we're eating, but it's about food availability, pricing, food accessibility, all these, all these socioeconomic factors that have a huge impact on how we eat. And then going back to the Eat Lancet, I don't know what your opinion was when it came out.
Yeah, on the one hand, I applaud the effort, because I think they took a very complex topic and they brought something out of it that you can somehow digest and you can take some main messages out of. Like if you look at the plate they suggest, you can take a major message out of that plant forward and reducing animal source foods. And that I found helpful, and they had a huge marketing machine behind it to get those findings out. On the other hand, I fully agree with what you say, that there's a lot of nuance around how that's interpreted. And something they did very well in the full report, but not so well in the broader communication, is that this needs to be adapted to local contexts. And for conditions, some people need to actually increase their animal source food consumption because they have so little access to nutritious foods that could actually help their health status. So that nuance in it, I think, definitely needed some more room. But that said, it's also sparked a dialogue in platforms that weren't necessarily talking about this before. So yeah, I see both sides of it. And overall, I feel it's had a positive impact and created an important dialogue. And I just think that it's super important to then discuss the nuance around it. So it sounds like we're in agreement that helping people to slowly and as best they possibly can introduce more and more plants into their diet and reduce animal source foods is something that we agree on is good for human health and good for the planet. So what are the most common challenges people face when they transition to a plant-based diet, and how do you support them to manage this?
One would be feeling extremely bloated.
Yes.
After, transitioning or starting to transition to more plant-based eating, which is completely understandable purely because we do not consume enough fiber. We do not consume enough plants. And what we don't realize is that if you've gone from, not consuming too much to just overloading your system with so much plants, that's going to cause some gastric problems. Bloating being one of them and constipation being the other. So this is another thing that I help my clients is being mindful about their sources of, let's say, meat alternatives, especially if you're starting to incorporate things like your beans, lentils, and chickpeas, which for me, I feel are the best meat alternatives in comparison to what's on the market. So your fake meats or plant meats or whatever you want to call them. To me, the transition should be simple or as simplistic as possible. You don't need exotic foods to make the transition either. So one would be bloating and constipation. The other thing would be potential nutrient deficiencies. So one thing that I've seen a lot, especially with women, because we are at a higher risk of iron deficiency. Two things that I noticed would be iron deficiency and B12, purely because the types of iron that we get from animal foods are very different to the types that we get from plants. And we just need to be smart about the combinations. For example, we know we need vitamin C to help with iron absorption. So what I get my clients to be strategic about, right, if you are basing a plant-based meal with, let's say, legumes, lentils or chickpeas, stock standard veggies or, let's say, ingredients would be things like tomato sauce, spinach, parsley, things or foods that are quite high in vitamin C to aid the absorption of iron from that food. So these tend to be kind of the common themes that would pop up. And then the other thing actually, which is about balance. A lot of the times people, it's maybe easier to focus more on your carb-rich or carb-dense foods like more pastas and noodles because, they are vegan anyway. So it's a lot of the time it tends to be carbohydrates and vegetables. But the way I get my clients to think about their diet as a whole is looking through food groups. If you are going to cut something out, what is the ideal substitute? So what I find is getting the right types or the right diversity when it comes to, let's say, plant-based sources of protein, or getting the right balance between carbs, protein, fats, and vegetables. That is another challenge that a lot of people get. Again, these tend to be the themes that pop up when it comes to mind, but obviously every person has their own challenge as well, depending on what their reality is. And this is why I always say, make sure you're working with someone that understands your reality. Because just like, there is no one size fits all approach, especially when it comes to this transition. And then we can start talking about seasonal food. And this is another thing it's not that easy to completely eat seasonally for quite a lot of people. So again, being a bit more mindful of that's where maybe, again, going back to that transition to more sustainable eating what's seasonal is also on the list there. But this is something that some of my clients do a little down the line if they're up for it. And I feel like people, if this is important to you, you will need to make the time. That's the same thing when it comes to reducing food waste, meal prepping. A lot of people complain, we're wasting so much food. I was like, well, you need to allocate and make the time to figure out how you can strategically shop and look what your week is going to look like in terms of meals.
Yeah, I think for me, that's one of the most important practices I have to just be more mindful and intentional with eating is to carve out the time to shop with intention and to cook with intention. And that actually saves me time. If I do it all on a Sunday as much as I can for the week, then that's saving me so much time running to the shop.
Exactly. Yeah. It frees up so much time, but I feel like there's always an excuse we're going to come up with. And we're human nature, we're always going to find an excuse, and we just tend to get lazy, and we're always going to find some sort of a resistance for some reason. Like, no, I cannot do that this week, or there's absolutely no time in my day.
Exactly. Yeah. And change always comes with resistance. So the more we can be familiar with that and work our way through it. So you're obviously very passionate about what you do, which is something I've always loved about how you engage with your work. And you mentioned, I guess it was about 10 years ago that you transitioned to building your own practice and not necessarily working for someone, but building and creating something new. And well, from my experience, that always takes a lot of courage and needs a lot of support. So where did you find that you needed that the most in those early days of doing something by yourself?
I think you'll need it at every stage in your journey. I don't think it kind of comes and goes. So for me, from the get-go, I think even early on being at uni, I knew that down the line I wanted to have my own thing. My brand started off as a blog. So that's how it started 10 years ago. And then it probably was seen as my side hustle because I had other jobs. And then as the years went by, I started getting more and more consulting opportunities, whether it's, working on international campaigns or recipe modification, working with restaurants. And then more and more people started to approach me to consult. I think it was around 2014, maybe 2014, 2015 is when I decided, right, it's now or never. I'm just going to dive in head first. Thinking about this now, I would just go back to what were you thinking, Sandra? Because I don't know how I thought it was the perfect time to start a practice, being 3 months pregnant. And my partner, so my husband at the time, was basically selling his company. It was a 50-50 chance. And just thinking back on it, I was like, how on earth did I think that was a great time to jump in head first? But you know what, again, as cliche as it sounds, follow your gut feeling. And for me, growing up in a household where failure has never been seen as a negative thing, whether it's in school, your private life, it's never been seen as something negative or to be ashamed of. For me, it was like an essential stepping stone to moving forward. And this is why I felt like that this whole fear of failing was not even, I don't think I've ever worried about that per se. I was like, well, if I do, it's a learning experience. I need to understand, right, why didn't this work? But I'm going to make it work somehow. But I just need to understand, okay, why didn't this approach work? Let's just find another way to do it. So a lot of people, used to call me, Sandra, not only do you have a plan A and a B, you have all the plans up until the Z, basically, just in case something doesn't go right. But I feel like if you truly, what I do is part of who I am. I don't see that as a job. And I'm very privileged and I'm very lucky to be in that position. And this is something that I do not take for granted, not one single day, because I know so many people in a different position, especially, let's say right now, during a pandemic with a lot of job losses and uncertainties. That also gives me that, that fuels that motivation, fuels that purpose. And obviously my clients and everyone that I've helped now for way over a decade and still being in touch with people and seeing how well they're doing. For me, that's like, right, my job is done. And, that is what I feel fuels my motivation to move forward.
I love how you explain the mindset piece of this too, that, how much fear of failure can hold one back if there's not a way to navigate it and to actually realize that, well, to learn and grow, I do need to fail and make mistakes. And if we can flip the mindset around that opens up a lot of new opportunities.
And also flipping it at a very young age. As I said, growing up, I've got two very successful parents, but I've seen their ups and downs. And even with the downs, or even with our challenges that we faced growing up, we were never, it was never seen as a bad thing. So, my dad would always sit us down and say, right, so what could have been, how would you have solved this differently? Or how would you have seen this differently? And so there was, and I think, as I said, back then I was like, oh, here we go again, but
Dad's coaching me again.
But hey, but you know what? Look, I always remind myself, and I was like, look at me now. And this is the other thing that I feel we do not give ourselves enough is credit or a pat on the back for how far we've come, because we also undermine our successes. And this is something that I was an expert at. undermining every success, not celebrating these little milestones, because I was like, oh, that's insignificant. And that was a change of mindset that I had to do actually, not even early on, later on throughout, my whole journey, especially in the last, let's say, 4 years.
Yeah, I have this group program I was telling you about before with a lot of young professionals in it. We were just talking about how we've never been taught to build a practice of celebrating successes, no matter how small, and how dangerous that is if we don't shift it.
Absolutely,
so yeah, I like how you've managed to do that. So there are no doubt, times with juggling all of this work and everything else that you might feel overwhelmed. I know you're doing more studies at the moment. So what are some of your most important practices, or your most important practice to help you ground and get perspective when you feel overwhelmed?
I think setting non-negotiables, and a few non-negotiables that I started to implement, especially in the last 2 years. I don't know if your listeners know a lot about my background, but I've had let's call a little bump in the road 2 years ago, where I literally crashed mentally. I had a burnout. I was doing way too much. I had a completely skewed idea of what success really means. And I literally worked myself to the ground, where it caused panic attacks. I was paralyzed in my own body, and a lot of things had to change. Again, especially if I know that, again, you cannot take the stress out of your life. It's how you approach stress and how you cope with it.
Right.
That took a lot. First, I think it's being, or let's say acknowledging and realizing that, okay, I need to take a step back and reassess everything, question everything. I needed help. So going into therapy, and I still am in therapy. I think that is a huge non-negotiable for me. So that mind pillar is an absolute non-negotiable. For me, it was learning different types of meditation. For me, it was about awareness. And that, people throw this word awareness so easily and freely, making it sound like, it's a piece of cake. Hey, it's one of the hardest things that I had to do, especially in the last 2 years. For me, I would say, so last year, my theme was being more present, more aware. And again, that took me 2 years, with therapy, et cetera, with certain non-negotiables that I do in my day-to-day life. But awareness is a big part of it. Non-negotiables like meditation, family time, me time, and doing what makes me happy as an individual. Because I have all these roles. I'm a mom, I'm a business owner, I'm a wife, I'm a this, I'm a that. And a lot of us can get lost as like, who am I to me?
Yeah.
And this is something that I would say I have completely changed, let's say 2019. So when people ask me, when or how would you say, when were you truly happy? And I was like, you know what? I think 2019 for me last year was probably one of the first years that I could say I was truly happy on every, front, whether it's professionally, personally. And again, it was hard work. People, if you're not going to put the work in, forget about it. You're not going to get anywhere. So it's really a mix of different things at the end of the day but as I said, in terms of non-negotiables, I put an end to my day now, because back then my day had no end. It's like, we have 24 hours in the day. What can I fill it up with?
Right.
Rest, meditation, no technology or minimal technology. I think this is one thing that has helped my own mental health, kind of taking a step back from technology, especially
Absolutely.
Social media.
Yes.
No emails, etc. after 8 or, So again, I do have times where there are exceptions, but the majority of the time, again, setting boundaries is another non-negotiable.
Setting and holding hurts.
Exactly. But that's the thing. I was going to say, it's maintaining whatever. For me, the biggest challenge, and this is for everyone, regardless of, if you're trying to eat sustainably, trying to, eat for better gut health. The issue is not changing. The issue is maintaining the change long-term, that it becomes second nature and it fits with what you want to do. Because if it's conflicting, if it doesn't work, and this is the same thing when it comes to the mind pillar, there's so many different types of therapies out there, but you need to find what works for you and what you're more likely to be consistent with. And I use meditation as an example with a lot of my clients, because if it's just simply a box they want to tick, it's not going to work. And that's when I actually get them off the whole meditation task until they feel, right, I need this. This is a part of my day-to-day life, and it does offer benefits. So, yeah.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I think we're so conditioned to have this performativity of box ticking and, achieving things. And I do have this with a lot of my coachees as well. It has to be more like a ritual and something you engage with for nourishment, not something you're ticking off as a box or to punish yourself or saying you're not enough if you haven't meditated today. That's when it becomes dangerous again. Yeah. So it sounds like you're in a nice position now to answer this last question. And that is, what does living a great and full life mean for you?
I feel like I'm going to sound so repetitive. But again, I know I mentioned this early on, and this is what I teach everyone. It's finding the right balance when it comes to these 4 pillars or these foundations of well-being: your mind, your movement, your nutrition, your sleep. I feel like when all these are in sync, this is where I feel like I can live my most joyful life or my most balanced life. But also understanding that you will need to keep redefining what balance means to you, depending on what stage of life you're on, what journey you're on, etc. So for me, I always go back to these 4 pillars. Again, as cliche as it sounds, but I have used these 4 pillars in my own journey. And I feel like when I've addressed all these 4, this is where I became my happiest, my most successful. So that would be my, that would be where I would come from, as I said, in terms of defining what living a joyful life comes from. I would just always go back to these 4 pillars. Because also, another important thing is we had this conversation and I've mentioned that, I can't remember who I was talking to, but they're like, well, how about this whole, social interactions, family, etc. I was like, look, that also comes to the mind part. You need humans, you need human interactions for a healthy, well-balanced mind.
Exactly.
So this is why I try to keep it simple and just use these 4.
And they're foundational to everything else in life.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Great Full Podcast. If you liked it, then please go ahead and subscribe and share it with a friend. And I would love to get your questions answered here. So if there's something that you would like answered or explored on this podcast, just send me an email to podcast@thegreatful.com and I'll do my very best to get your questions answered here on the show. Music in this episode came from Blue Dot Sessions.